Hello everybody, my name is Daulton Nelson, and today I'd like to give my thoughts on a game I just beat. That game being Space Harrier II for the PC. Space Harrier II is a third-person shooter developed and published by Sega. Space Harrier 1985 is one of the best arcade games ever made. It's got fast shooting action mixed with colorful and weird space-age aesthetics, and a kick-ass soundtrack to boot. So, a sequel to it would be a huge undertaking, no doubt. I personally don't know how you could top it with anything other than a re-release with more features to mess around with. Alas, Sega did try to recapture the magic by having the same crew working on Space Harrier II, including the legendary designer Yu Suzuki, for the newly released Sega Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis here in the States. In fact, Harrier II even released as a launch title for the system, showing the confidence Sega had in the Space Harrier name. As far as the history between me and Harrier II goes, I found out that there was a sequel to Space Harrier pretty much right after I found out the original existed. After playing Space Harrier and loving it, I went online to see what the sequel looked like, only to become disinterested as it didn't look as good as its predecessor. Fast forward to the present, and Space Harrier II is now included in most Sega Mega Drive bundles now. So, because I have this review thing happening, I thought this would be a great time to actually play the title and see if it stacks up to the fantastic arcade original. Right off the bat, one of the first things you'll notice is the difference in looks for 2. Expectedly, 2 is a lot more pixelated than its predecessor. No doubt the Mega Drive can't produce the same crisp quality an arcade can. However, the development team does make up for it by having a lot more contrast between game objects and environments. The team also took the time to make some nice looking sprite work on things. There are some really good looking enemies in the game. Especially the bosses, which look pretty amazing. The bosses include demon turtles, Medusa snakes, and giant manticores, which sets 2 apart from its predecessor. Another way it does this is by having some more intricate boss fights. Some bosses will weave in and out of invincibility, creating these almost turn-based battles of who's attacking at the time. Unfortunately, there are other ways in which 2 just doesn't live up to the experience of what came before it, like the soundtrack, which is fine, but it definitely doesn't compare to Hiroshi Kawaguchi's work for the first, and that might have to do with how 2's speed is slower than the arcade original, which again is to be expected. Unfortunately, the frame rate of the game also suffers because of the hardware. This was actually my first time playing a Space Harrier game that doesn't have a smooth or consistent frame rate. I could tell that it was definitely affecting the gameplay here. The game just feels really choppy. It gets really bad when the game tries to do the camera tilting and panning simulation when the Harrier character reaches a stage boundary. 2's performance becomes really staggered then. And this partially contributes to 2's difficulty feeling a little bit harder than the original. Space Harrier requires the player to be in sync with the game by the frame, so anything that throws that off will cause the player to make poor split-second adjustments. Another way the game can feel a little harder is the indestructible pillar placement within the stages. Space Harrier had this as well, but in that game, these pillars are usually spaced out and aren't introduced until late into the second stage, but in 2 they show up right away in the second stage, and are clustered together to a point where dodging them becomes essential. You can tell this is an intentional design decision rather than a screen resolution problem by how some of these pillars will even be put in patterns that can box you in, forcing you to take a shot and even a life. Luckily, Sega did put in a stage selection feature where you can jump right into whichever stage you want. Just know that you can't beat the game unless you start from stage 1. But the aspect that really hurts 2's longevity and interest for me is that it is just the same game all over again. 2 does try to separate itself from Space Harrier, but it's not enough for me to prefer to play it ever again. Plus, some elements just don't match up to the original, like the backgrounds or the bonus rounds. Ultimately, I see no point in recommending Space Harrier 2 when I can just recommend the original, and you would have a much better time playing that. So I'm going to give Space Harrier 2 a final score of a 4 out of 10. Maybe if the game was reworked to match the performance of the original, with better graphics, better sound hardware, and better design approaches, Space Harrier II could detach itself from its predecessor, but seriously, you should just play the 1985 original. It's that great. That concludes my review of Space Harrier II. If you like my reviews, you can like, comment, or subscribe. I also have social media links down in the description below, as well as a link to my online portfolio where you can see video game design works that I have done. And with that out of the way, please make sure to have a great day.